So this evening's workshop is being presented by Andy Bunn, who joined the Hawaii Conference Foundation as the Executive Director of the Foundation on November 1st in 2019. Some of you may have known him earlier as he was the conference attorney since 1996. Prior to joining the foundation, Andy was a partner at Chun Kerr LLP, a Honolulu-based law firm, and his concentration at Chun Kerr was real estate and general business law. Joining Andy will be Corinne Murashige, the controller for the Hawaii Conference and Foundation. So please join me in welcoming Andy and Corinne.
Thank you, Lori. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. I wish we could all be meeting in person, but here we are, at least with the ability to talk and meet remotely, as it were. It's been an exciting handful of months since I've started here, and a real pleasure, a real change for my law practice, and really terrific to be working with all the great folks here in the conference and with all of our churches and the people of our churches. I'm going to share my screen with you here, so bear with me 1 minute as I get into some slides. Okay. So this afternoon, I want to give you a little, initially an introduction to the foundation. There are, one of the things that became apparent to me in talking with folks as I've started into this job is that there's a lot of folks who don't know what the foundation really does and what its purposes are. So I want to go through some basics and talk about that this evening, and then we'll give you an update as to some of our holdings. So we'll talk about the purposes and why the foundation was created, its powers and authority, how the foundation holds land. Then we'll talk a bit about our current assets and holdings, and then we'll get into our expenses and drawn on investments from last year, and we'll talk about exactly what's been happening there. And I'm pleased that our controller Corinne Murashige is helping me this evening. She'll be chiming in from time to time and probably correcting me on a few things, but we'll also be talking through some of the slides. So without further ado. So what is the foundation? The foundation is the asset and property management arm of the Hawaii Conference. We are a very close partner with the conference. We support the conference, but we are a separate Hawaii nonprofit corporation than the conference. The foundation is also a tax-exempt charity. Pursuant to 501c3, many of you have heard that term. That is a type of charity in which donors may deduct their donations on their own tax returns when they support us. So it's a desirable thing. The conference is a charity, and all your churches are also tax-exempt charities. The purposes of the foundation. So what was the thinking behind creating the foundation? Well, the thought was, and this is right from our charter, to be a foundation and depository of the property for the investment and use of the Hawaii Conference and its member churches and affiliates. And we're also intended to promote the interests and welfare of the churches and ministers of the Hawaii Conference and of the General Synod and other instrumentalities of the United Church of Christ and affiliated institutions, insofar as their interests are within an area of concern to the conference. So we would be Hawaii-oriented and Hawaii-focused with respect to our support of the national instrumentalities. And finally, more generally, and definitely not third, these are not a hierarchical list of priorities or purposes, but our purpose is to advance the cause of Christian religion. But why was the foundation created? The foundation grew out of a desire to separate the fiduciary role of money management from the money spending functions of the conference. This is the dynamic of the program versus the purse. In the 50s and 60s, there was a concern that the spending decisions of the conference were being influenced too much by specific program needs, especially those on Oahu. In other words, not considering the broader picture of the whole in making some of those decisions. There was a desire to ensure that the assets of the conference would be stewarded for wider consideration, including the needs of associations and other churches, and especially neighbor island churches, and that those assets would be invested for future needs. It was hoped that this change in creating the foundation would restore confidence among the traditional and donors and potential donors to the conference and would lead to a resumption of giving towards endowment for the conference. The foundation was created in 1968, and at the Aha Pae in 1968, the Aha supported the creation of the foundation and expressed the following reasons for creating the foundation: refinement and improvement of investment function, maximum protection of assets from the operation functions. That's what we just talked about, making sure that there's a broader prioritization, focus on the whole in spending. More autonomous service to churches in a trust capacity. So the foundation, part of its purpose is to provide direct support and church and services to churches that are members of the conference, and to provide a facility that is more attractive to donors who wish to create endowments for flexibility and safety from erosion, meaning that those endowments would survive time and endure in perpetuity. So what powers does the foundation have to carry out all these purposes? Well, the foundation has the power to receive and administer funds and securities and other property, but exclusively for religious and charitable purposes. The foundation has the power to take and hold any property by deed or gift or purchase or otherwise. Where a gift is made to the foundation and prescribes or controls or has rules about the use of the property, the foundation has to honor the intent of the beneficiary, or the intent of the gift maker to use the property for the purpose of the gift. So if the gift was made in support of a church, the foundation would only use that property in support of that church. We have the power to sell and convey and dispose of property and to invest and reinvest our assets in order to grow them. The power to develop and generally deal with the property and to expend and distribute the income and principal of the holdings, provided it will promote the objects and purposes of the foundation. With the right to enter into and make contracts, as well as to make gifts and grants, provided those gifts and grants are exclusively for religious and charitable purposes. And finally, we have the power to receive and hold and invest and reinvest properties on behalf of a member church of the conference. Basically, we have all the powers that would be accorded to a Hawaii nonprofit corporation that is recognized as a tax-exempt charity by the Internal Revenue Service. So how did land come to the foundation and to the conference? Well, much of the foundation's property, of course, was received from the conference after the foundation was created in 1968. But the conference and the foundation over the years have acquired properties in a number of ways. They've purchased land from third parties. Those would be lands that were purchased specifically for investment purposes, or they may have also been purchased for a mission purpose. We've acquired properties from local churches directly, where those churches have desired the property be held for safekeeping in a trust arrangement. We've also received gifts and grants from third-party individuals and entities wanting assurance that that property would continue to be used for church purposes or in support of church purposes and within the fellowship of our United Church of Christ. Those properties have come from individuals, like Titus Cone on the Big Island, who's one of our famous missionaries, as well as from the sovereign directly, from the Ali'i at the time of the Mahele, and from the territory of Hawaii in later years. So how we hold title is, we hold title in many ways, all the ways that you could imagine, starting with fee simple ownership, that is outright ownership where no strings attached. An example of that would be Craigside Tower 3. We also have leasehold property, where the foundation leases property from another. For example, at Hokuloa Church, we lease property from the state of Hawaii. The Waianeke Cabins we do as well. Out in Moanalua, we lease church property from the shopping center owner and the US government. So we also have leased fee property, that is where we own the fee, but we lease it out under a long-term lease to a third party. The Craigside Towers 1 and 2 are examples of that. And finally, we own a number of properties in trust, where those properties are subject to a trust agreement that benefit a third party. In almost all cases, those would be local churches. The trust arrangements are both explicit in that when the property was conveyed to the foundation in trust, the granting instrument said specifically, this is to be held in trust for somebody. Campbell Park is an example of that in Lahaina. They also may be implied in that at the time that the property was deeded to the foundation, there was an understanding or a policy in place at the time that dictated that it be held in trust. The church out in Hawall is an example of one that we hold in an implied trust. So what does it mean to hold property in trust for a church? The foundation holds the legal title to the property, but for the benefit of a local church. So the local church would retain the right to use the property and the expectation that they would use the property. And the foundation is there under the trust arrangement to ensure that the title is not lost to the church as a result of financial insolvency, judgment creditors, or third-party takings. So why do we hold property in trust for churches? It's good. There's a nice piece that comes from the conference's board policy manual in 1972 that actually was in effect in 1968 when the foundation was created, that outlines the basic policy of why we do it, and by and large these still apply today. The conference at that time said, let us point out some of the advantages of when titles to church properties are held in trust. Our main purpose, it said, was to strengthen the churches. The property becomes part of the assets of the whole conference, and in that way helps the conference have a strong financial standing, enhances the conference's credit and borrowing power for the good of the churches, makes funds more readily available to churches because of that improved credit for building needs and other purposes. It thought was it would be a consolidation of property for the good of all, and that gives churches the benefit, and would also give the churches the benefit of counsel, of trustees and staff, and I would add professional advisors that we engage to provide counsel to us. The third reason articulated is that it stops dissident groups from within the church from perverting the property to their use. So this would be the steeplejacking scenario that comes up from time to time, and that we've talked about and has raised in a number of cases over the years, certain issues. Fourth, the titles and the legal papers related to the properties are deposited with the foundation for safekeeping. Back in the day, it was in a central fireproofs file, which we still have actually, with original files in it. But of course today, we have also electronic files, so it's easier to maintain those files. But the keeping of those files with the foundation does provide continuity. As everybody knows, leadership changes over time, church leadership changes over time, and so with the foundation, we have professional management of these records, and so continuity there. Under the arrangement we have, our trust arrangement with churches, churches are given full responsibility and freedom in the care and use of their properties, including the responsibility for covering the property and facilities with insurance, repairing and maintaining buildings and grounds, improving facilities for their specific use, if necessary, purchasing land which may be needed for additional use, and for covering taxes related to the property holdings. Now, if a church is unable to meet those expenses, and many of our small churches are, the foundation is there to provide coverage and does provide coverage. The sixth reason articulated by the conference was that the properties would be watched by the foundation and the conference to ensure there was adequate insurance, there was no possibility of encroachment or claims arising to take care of the property. Our use of the property, because it's for the benefit of a local church, is only done after consultation with that local church. So anything that happens related to the church would only happen after a discussion with that church. Finally, there was, back in 1972, this statement that churches who wish to get their title to the property, the trustees would be willing to sell the property to the church at a fair appraised value. That scenario really applies where the foundation has purchased the property initially for the church, not so much where the church has deeded the property to the foundation to hold in trust. There is now in place, adopted by the Aha Pae, something called Guidelines A, which is the policy related to returning property to a local church. But I just want to comment, call your attention to their summary of the policy, which concluded that the holding of the titles to church properties in this way is in line with commonly accepted democratic idea of mutual assistance and the use of our assets for the greatest good. It gives churches the freedom to use and develop their properties and facilities without interference, and it puts the strength of our total resources behind all churches and makes it possible for us to help churches when they need assistance within the limits of our ability. So that was articulated back in the late 60s and 70s. Just a comment about Guidelines A, which I mentioned. For a church that property that we are holding in trust for that church, if that congregation desires a return of that property, there are certain criteria that have been adopted by the Aha Pae for the return. The first is that the church needs to be incorporated in the state of Hawaii as a nonprofit corporation. It needs to have an active membership with potential in the community and members that have property stewardship skills. It has, the church needs to have a potential for an effective ministry in the community and a track record for doing so for at least 5 years. The church needs to have 3 years of financial responsibility with an annual budget subject to audit. The church would need to share in the expenses, whatever legal and court costs would be involved in ending the trust arrangement. The church would obviously need to agree to comply with any restrictions if the property, if they're imposed by the original grantor of the property, such as church use restrictions or that, which are often found in deeds. And finally, the property would revert back to the conference or the foundation in the event of the dissolution of the church, or that the church is not viable in our policy. That is, it doesn't meet more than 3 times a year. The property is not used for church work, or the church withdraws from the association. So these is the policy that the AHA had articulated with respect to sort of where you draw the line with the ability of a church to get the return of the property. So now I want to turn to today, where we are financially, and give you a brief picture of our holdings. And for that, I'm going to ask Corinne Murashige to walk us through some of our current holdings.
Hi, it's a little weird not to be able to see anybody. It's really discombobulating, I must say. But okay, aloha to everyone who's here that I cannot see. So as of June 30, 2020, which was the end of the last fiscal year, the foundation is roughly a $60 million institution, including custodial accounts from the investment pool. The net assets are at about $44 million. Okay, so fiscal year end 6/30/20, we had investment holdings. The investment pool was approximately 45 million. 30% or about 14 million was the foundation's unrestricted funds. Those funds can be used for any operational purpose. 7% or 3.1 million were custodial and restricted funds. Custodial funds are those funds that are, the churches, the associations have requested to be a part of the investment pool, but there isn't a specific use necessarily. They can take their money out, within restrictions depending on how much they're requesting to take out. Restricted funds.
Yeah, custodial funds. Yeah, just going to say, Corinne, the custodial funds do not belong to the foundation. Those belong to the churches and the investors who give them to co-invest with the foundation.
Thank you. That was so much better than how I explained it. Okay. The restricted funds are restricted for a specific use. For example, the conference has the education fund that has to be used for educational purposes. We also have restricted funds that have to be used for scholarships, for example. 3% or 1.5 million are restricted funds held, I'm sorry, I didn't say 7% of the custodial and restricted funds are held for the conference. 3% or 1.5 million are restricted funds held for other churches, scholarships, or other purposes. 31% or 14.2 million is endowment funds where the corpus cannot be spent and the income is restricted for certain donor specified purposes. 28% or 13.1 million is in non-conference custodial funds.
Thank you. And our assets are invested in a balanced portfolio, meaning one that considers risk factors and allocates certain investments towards a higher risk profile and certain investments to a lower risk profile, with the idea that we can benefit a little bit from some market gains and activity, but we still are protecting a portion of our portfolio from the ups and downs of the markets. And we have about 52% of our holdings invested in equities, meaning stocks, company holdings, primarily through mutual funds that are groupings of different stocks. About 24% of our holdings are invested in U.S. fixed income, so primarily bonds and annuity type investments that give you guaranteed percentage return. And 24% are what we call alternative investments, which kind of sit right in the middle, that allow us a little more gain when the markets are up, but are protected from the downside a little bit. Real estate, we hold almost 175 parcels of land owned or leased or managed by the foundation. And that's measured from the tax map key parcels that the state assigns to different lots. Institutionally, we hold 60 church properties. Now that's just an institutional count by church name. Really, only 36 of those churches are currently active churches. 24 are inactive, some of which have been inactive for many, many decades. The land in total aggregates to about 3,900 acres statewide. And we carry the land at a book value at about $17 million. So that on our balance sheet is what you would see allocated to the real estate. But if you look at the real property assessed value, if you were to just add it up by going online and looking at these, it would come up to almost $300 million in assessment value. But I caution you that first of all, most of our properties are exempt from taxation. And second, the real property assessed valuations do not factor in the restrictions on the use of our properties. Many of our properties are restricted to church use only. And if we can't use it for church use, it reverts to the original grantor. So that would represent a significant lowering of value if you were simply to look at what's the public records saying. Of the real estate, of the non-Craigside properties, many of you are familiar with the Craigside property in Nu'uanu that was developed on conference land, but of the non-Craigside properties, about 25% are held in trust for churches. And really another 20% of that is held in these implied trusts that I mentioned earlier. Of those, only 6% of the non-Craigside properties are income producing. So that means 94% of those properties are non-income producing. And therein lies one of the greatest challenges to the foundation, that despite having many holdings, much real estate to deal with, very little of it is income producing. But most of it still needs to be taken care of, and the taxes paid, insured, maintenance taken care of. So that's a significant, and has for many years been a significant challenge for the foundation. And I just drew this picture, and this is the church at Pu'unenea, Maui. It is not one of our churches, but it kind of represents the challenge of taking care of an old church. So Corinne, maybe you can give us a little bit on the Craigside properties.
Okay, so what about Craigside 3? People seem to have the impression that Craigside 3 is a huge cash cow for the foundation, where actually it's the opposite. So Craigside 3 was supposed to be both an investment property and a missional property. So the Kokua program was started to provide below market housing for the elderly, especially those retired from or still in Christian service. And the Kokua program worked by basically giving rent concessions to those people. So the original target the trustees had set was that rent concessions would be 25% of net income. However, net income has decreased consistently over the years. For the fiscal year ended 6/30/19, there was a net loss. So if you exclude the non-cash expenses, like depreciation, for example, the foundation had net cash of about $71,655. Concessions for the 6 Kokua program participants were 62% of net cash. So just for your information, in addition to all of this, the foundation has about $500,000 in loans still outstanding that we're paying because of the special assessments that were made against Craigside. What about Craigside 1 and 2? Craigside 1 and 2, the foundation has the fee interest in Craigside 1 and 2. The foundation does not own the condo units. In effect, they own the land under the units. So the fee interest had been offered for sale, and many of the unit owners had purchased their fee interest, but foundation still has fee interest in 19 units of Craigside 1 and 2. The lease rent was supposed to be renegotiated for 10 years from January 1st, 2017 to December 31st, 2026. But the unit owners did not agree with the proposed rent. So we had to go through formal arbitration. Most unit owners, and we know this in Hawaii, do not want to lease a whole unit. The fact is the building is aging. And there's an issue of many owners of the units and fee interest within the buildings. So say, for example, the building reaches the end of its useful life, and it has to be broken down. There has to be consensus with a majority of the owners, which makes leasehold really not desirable. Okay, so for decades, the entire amount of the net income from Craigside 1 and 2 had been transferred to a custodial fund that the conference would access to meet budget needs. So Craigside 1 and 2 really had not been benefiting the foundation for many years. So here's go back to here's a little picture that I drew of the problem of the foundation. Are we having technical difficulties?
Sorry, no, yeah, a little bit of technical difficulties.
Okay.
You should be on the slide now.
Okay. So what are the expenses of the foundation? Staffing. Foundation has only 3 full-time employees, full-time equivalent employees. The executive director, who in this picture is saying help, which is what Andy says a lot, I'm sure, if not out loud, then in his mind. So we have a full-time executive director, we have a full-time executive assistant, and we have 2 half-time accounting employees. So Ana Osalvo, the accountant, and I are 50% for the foundation, 50% for the conference. So again, if you think about how many properties have to be managed, as well as the investment pool, that's a lot for that small staff to handle. Some of the other expenses that we have are property taxes, insurance, and repairs and maintenance for the properties, plus the monthly transfers to the conference.
So just to talk about, to put some numbers to that, looking at last year's fiscal year, operating revenues, including the Craigside and the other non-Craigside rents, were about $1.7 million. The cash transfers to the conference to support direct missional needs was almost $300,000. The cash reserves that we needed to replenish in order to cover the outlays was almost $90,000. And the operating expenses was about $2.2 million. So substantial expenses, which resulted in a deficit and a need to draw $850,000 from investment in the fiscal year of 2020. Those expenses consisted of salaries and benefits, as Corinne mentioned, travel for meetings, professional and consulting fees, materials and supplies, equipment leases, and of course support for the mission of the conference, which is our primary purpose, as well as the rental operations and expenses related to Craigside, which are substantial. Also included in the administrative budget for the foundation are property expenses that support the conference and the associations and the respective churches, which include insurance for properties, repairs and maintenance on properties, and real property taxes that are not otherwise reimbursed to the foundation by local churches under a trust arrangement. And most of the holdings that we have, we do not get full reimbursements of those expenses. So we cover those. Corinne, you want to talk a bit about
Sure.
the draw history?
Sure. So what happened is when I came on board, I looked at what were the draws from the foundation unrestricted account, which again is what we can use for operational funds from fiscal year 10 to fiscal year 20. So just for your information, a safe withdrawal is between 4.5% to 5%. So the reason that's considered a safe withdrawal is because the investments are earning, interest, dividends, gains. So if you take out between 4.5% to 5% of the money, your balance, there's a specific formula that we follow. Theoretically, you wouldn't run out of money. However, if you look at what the actual percentage draws were over the years, for example, let's look at fiscal year 12, which was at 21.66%. So just to give you some context, let's say I have $100. So this year I take out $21.66. I can do that for 5 more years before I totally run out of money. So what was happening is the foundation would have to continue to take out more than what was considered a safe draw in order to meet the needs of the foundation and the conference. So what would happen is the foundation unrestricted would start to run low on money. Again, back to that $100 example. In 5 years, theoretically, I could have spent that whole thing, right? So what would happen is the foundation would have to sell a piece of property in order to build back the amount of the unrestricted fund. So again, if you remember, the draw that was required for fiscal year 20 was 860 something thousand. Foundation has about 14 million. So that we are still not at a safe draw. But if you look at fiscal year 20, the draw was at 6.78%. Why? Because we realized what was happening. We immediately started to put into effect some measures to cut spending.
So yes, as Corinne says, the average draw over time is not desirable from a management of funds standpoint. The Hawaii Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act has some parameters to consider, and generally a 4.5% to 5% draw is considered a safe draw that would preserve the corpus of investments over time. the larger draw was necessitated by prioritizing both conference program needs as well as meeting escalating maintenance expenses for properties. So it's a very difficult situation, but one that that we can correct. So is it time to throw in the towel on this? No, of course not. The foundation is still a solvent entity, has assets, and there's lots of opportunity. And we're at a point where we can reduce spending and improve performance to preserve the corpus. Some things that we are doing and considering, of course, is reducing expenses. The conference already this year has had to endure a reduction in draw and has adopted a budget, or is in the process. We'll discuss a budget at this meeting at the AHA, which it reflects some belt tightening that needs to be made. We're also looking, it's two sides of a coin, right? Cutting expenses is one way, and the other thing we have to look at is income generation, and how do we improve our income generation so that we can build up the corpus to cover operational expenses and meet the transfer needs, the budget needs of the conference. So we're looking at our properties that are not performing well, our investment properties, and considering how to reinvest them, sell them, and invest into something that has promise of better performance and a higher yield. Craigside Holdings are one group of properties that we're looking at in that regard, as well as the conference's office building, which is at this point in time probably a bit larger than the needs of the foundation and the conference. So that's in process, that's being studied. We're also looking at other non-income producing properties to see if the income production can be had from them, provided they are not properties that we need to maintain and protect for historic purposes or legacy purposes. We're very sensitive to the need to ensure we try and protect those properties, which will never be income producing, but are important for our legacy. So our goal is to get the funding that the foundation and the conference to a sustainable level so that the good work of the conference and all of the churches can continue in perpetuity. That's our goal. So let me just close by answering the question of who runs the foundation. We have a board of trustees of 11 members, all terrific people. I've enjoyed meeting them and working with them and look forward to continuing those relationships. We have 3 members who are elected by the conference council. 4 members of our board are nominated by the foundation board, but then elected by the conference council. 2 members of our board are nominated by the conference council and then elected at the Aha Pae. And we have one coming up at this AHA. And then our conference minister serves on our board by virtue of his position, and the chairperson of the conference council serves on the foundation board by virtue of her position. And Caroline Peters Belsom is just rotating off, and I believe a new nominee, Eric Anderson, will be elected to that position by virtue of his position at the upcoming AHA. The board has officers. There's a chairperson, Roberta Charling, a first vice chairperson, Alitha Kaohi, a secretary, Reverend Kealoho Alika, and a treasurer, Gloria Kobayashi. And as we said earlier, we have a staff. We have the trustees hired me, I'm happy to say. Thank you very much, trustees. The executive director. And the director in turns hires a support staff, which include a full-time administrative assistant, Lorena Arata, as many of you have met, serves in that capacity. A half-time controller, which is Corinne, and a half-time accountant, which is Ann Salvo. So that brings us to the end of the formal presentation. It's been an interesting, not even a year, haven't even been at it for a year. There have been many challenges in this one year. Just for me, just learning about the foundation and the many holdings that we have and the many churches, and has been a challenge. It's been a great pleasure, though, to meet the people involved and see the properties. I admit that I still have much to learn, and there's a lot to go. So I ask everybody's patience and indulgence as you bring me along in the history of your specific church or the issue, or that which we need to do together. And as you have heard tonight, there have been challenges in the past, some spending challenges, but the foundation is healthy financially. And these are challenges that I'm confident that together with our capable board, we can resolve, solve, and put our conference and our foundation on a footing so that in perpetuity, we can continue to do God's work in the United Church of Christ here in Hawaii. So thank you very much for tuning in. And at this point, I will turn it over to for some questions. And I'll have to say that if we can't get to all your questions, which is probable because I've yammered on too long, and I apologize for that, you may email me and I'd be happy to respond to you.
Thank you, Andy. This is Dorothy working with Laureen to give you the questions that have come up. You'll be happy to know there are not a ton of them, but the first one is easy. What's that church in the last picture there?
That church is Ha'ula. It is. It's Ha'ula Congregational Church in Ha'ula on Oahu. And that is a church as many of you know, we've had some challenges with that church in that we have actually two church groups desiring to use the same property. And it's been quite contentious and even has gone through litigation, but I'm hoping we've come out on the other side of that and are working towards some solutions out there.
Okay, next question. Will this be printed in full and sent to churches to share with the members? I'm assuming they're talking about this PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, we can print it. We can make a PDF and share it with folks. No problem.
Okay, and Kyle is asking a question about whether socially responsible investing screens are used for the funds that are chosen for investments.
Can I
yes.
take it? Okay, because I saw
yes,
it, so
ahead,
I pulled up the information. So yes, okay. we do have socially responsible investing. Some of the screens that the United Church Funds uses is they do not invest in securities of companies that derive a significant portion of their revenues from tobacco production, firearm or ammunition production, military or nuclear weapons production, private prison operation, coal extraction or oil extraction via tar sands, which I don't know what that is, so don't ask me a question on that. Okay, and they also do not invest in companies who have environmental or greenhouse gas impacts like carbon emissions, toxic emissions, waste, that have violations of worker safety or human rights violations.
Thank you.
Okay, question from Ron. How many managers manage the investments? Is it divided amongst, for example, 3 different managers to ensure the best returns?
I can take that.
There are, oh yeah, go ahead, Corinne, thank you.
Okay, so we have basically 3 different firms that we work with. We have United Church Funds, we have First Hawaiian Bank, and we have the Raymond James. So we do have 3 different investment firms.
And also from Ron, whose responsibility is it to watch over the draw percentage?
That would be the trustees of the foundation. It is the foundation's responsibility to review expenditures, to consider expenditures as it goes through the budget process, and to consider when there's pressure to make expenditures that are in excess of budget, which is a common pressure because of unforeseen needs, to consider the need for those expenditures in that given fiscal year. But ultimately, responsibility is with the trustees, but the trustees, of course, rely upon staff for help and guidance and implementation of the work.
Okay,
And that's all the questions.
I see one question on YouTube from Linda. Is the conference changing locations?
We are looking, as I mentioned in the presentation, at possibly downsizing our office building. Over the years, the conference staff has gotten smaller. And so we probably at this point have a little too much square footage. We have more square footage than we need in an office building here at Nu'uanu. So there's actually a committee, there's a joint committee of the conference and the foundation, which is looking at alternatives for relocation, and as well as alternatives for subdividing and leasing out a portion of a building. But the point being that looking at a way to recapture some of the equity that we're sitting on in this office building that we're not using at this pure point in time.
Okay, a question has popped up on the screen from Carissa. Being that most trust deeds of church properties were given by Nakapuna years ago, how can churches research its trusts?
Well, obviously, a church could come and talk to us, and we would help them look through our files to learn what, to share what we know about the property and the terms upon which the property was conveyed to the foundation in trust. And we're happy to cooperate in that regard. Churches who want to do their own research can look at the property records. All deeds are recorded and kept in the Bureau of Conveyances in the state of Hawaii. And you can go down to the Bureau and research them. Many of them are electronically available. You could also engage a title company to help with that research as well. But yeah, and if a church desires more information about how we hold title, and we're happy to talk and dialogue with the church about that.
Okay, question from Judy. What exactly is the difference in the conference, HCUCC, and the foundation, HCF?
Can I answer that question?
Sure.
If you don't mind. It's sort of like Kamehameha Schools, Bishop Estate. So Kamehameha Schools is the program side, Bishop Estate is the asset side. So similarly, the conference is the program side, the foundation is the asset side. Would you like to expound on that, Andy?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, it's important to understand that the conference and the foundation are separate corporations. They have separate existence legally under the laws of the state of Hawaii and tax laws and all of that. Although we're related in as much that essentially the conference appoints the trustees of the foundation. And that's because the purpose of the foundation is to steward assets, is to take care of the assets for the conference, as well as for individual churches who have that trust in us. So we although we are separate, legally separate entities, we are all, working together to support the same mission.
And Russell is asking, what happens when a church property when the church building's dilapidated, membership almost zero, yard is being maintained perfectly because existing church graveyard there. The property is in trust to the HFC so that the church for that church's use. Got it?
Well, if the church is, I guess that's one of the challenges we have. I think that, there are a lot of very, older church properties where there's a small congregation that don't have the ability to maintain the church property. And in that case, so long as there is a mission use for the property, we will work as hard as we can to keep that mission use in place for the property, to keep that church on the property, doing their good work. And if it's necessary for us to help the church with maintenance expenses, the foundation will do that. And as well as the insurance expenses and the real property taxes, because we don't want that property to be lost. Through, the falling down for a failure of maintenance, or loss in a tax sale because the taxes weren't paid, that sort of thing. It's important to keep that. And we also want to honor the intent of the original congregation that may have conveyed that property to us in trust. So we have to consider the wishes of that original group as well. So, but it's a good question because it summarizes the really the difficult challenges the foundation has. And we as I said, we're financially healthy, but we only have certain amount of limited resources, and we could spend it all on bringing up every property into pristine condition. And so we have to make some tough choices sometimes, and we have to work with our local congregations to help take care and steward the properties.
The last comment is thank you for the presentation from Ron Fujiyoshi. This is the first time I have heard such a clear presentation. And so Russell adds his mahalo.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to do it. As I said, I'm learning, and I do think that I want to share what I know with everybody, and I think some transparency with what the foundation does and what some of the challenges we have is only going to help everybody understand and really honor the original intent of the AHA in creating the foundation, in that it's for the greater good of us all. So I'm happy to be a part of it, and it's my pleasure.
Can I just say something about Andy? When I heard that he was going to be hired, I said, what? He's not going to start till November? And, our Sherman left in July. I said, you sure this guy is worth it? Worth the wait? And Roberta said, yes, he is. And I want to tell you that, yes, he is. He really has the heart for the church. He's one of those really clean, pure-hearted people. Really has the church mission at heart. I just want to tell you folks that.
All right,
Thank you for that, Corinne. You're embarrassing me, so I'm so I'll turn it over to Lori.
Thanks. All right, friends, we've come to the end of our time this evening. I just want to respond to Judy's question about the difference between the conference and the foundation. I just want you to know that the conference has more fun. But anyway, thank you to Andy and Corinne for information and updates on the Hawaii Conference Foundation.